The knock that changed everything. For Angela Carter, a 65-year-old widow, mornings had become predictable since moving into her new home. Nestled in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, the house was a gift from her eldest son, Howard, a gesture of love meant to ease her into a peaceful retirement. Angela spent her days unpacking, arranging furniture, and acclimating to the unfamiliar space, determined to make it her sanctuary. But this morning, her sanctuary would turn into a battleground she never anticipated. The faint knock at the door barely registered over the rhythmic hum of her vacuum. Angela, dressed in her usual housecoat and slippers, paused mid-clean and glanced toward the door. The neighborhood was silent save for the chirping of birds and the occasional distant hum of a car engine. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced ones. Angela shuffled to the door and opened it, expecting a delivery man or perhaps a neighbor introducing themselves. Instead, she was met with a sight that sent a jolt through her heart. Standing on her porch was a young boy, no older than 10 or 11. He was black, his small frame trembling as he clutched a battered shoebox to his chest. Tears streaked his dusty cheeks, and his eyes darted nervously behind him. "Ma'am, please help," the boy stammered, his voice shaky and barely audible. "It's my sister. She's—" His words trailed off as he clutched the shoebox tighter, his knuckles white. Angela's heart sank. "Oh my goodness, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling with concern. "Are you hurt? Where are your parents?" The boy glanced over his shoulder toward the street, his body language radiating fear. He'll come for me," he whispered, taking a step closer to Angela. "Please, let me in." Angela instinctively reached for the boy's shoulder, intending to lead him inside. But before she could act, a loud, gruff voice boomed from across the street. "J.D. in." The shout was so forceful that Angela jumped. The boy froze in place, his eyes widening in terror. Angela's gaze shifted to the source of the voice. A man emerged from the house directly across the street, his tall, broad frame dominating the doorway. He was wearing a white tank top stained with grease and grime, his face darkened with an expression of barely contained rage. His piercing glare locked onto the boy. "Get over here," the man barked, his tone leaving no room for defiance. Angela felt her protective instincts flare as the boy visibly cowered. "Sir," she called out, her voice steady despite the chill creeping up her spine. "Is this your son? He seems—" "Jaden, now," the man interrupted, ignoring her entirely. His presence was suffocating, his tone leaving Angela no doubt that this was a man accustomed to control. The boy hesitated, clutching the shoebox tighter. Then, with one last pleading glance at Angela, he turned and scurried back across the street, his small legs moving as fast as they could. The man grabbed him roughly by the arm, yanking him inside before slamming the door shut with a resounding bang. The quiet street returned to its previous stillness, but Angela's heart was far from calm. She stood frozen on her porch, her mind racing. The fear in the boy's eyes was unmistakable, as was the desperation in his voice. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Angela lingered for a moment longer, debating whether to follow up, but the memory of the man's hostile glare made her think twice. Angela returned inside, locking the door behind her. She paced the living room, glancing occasionally at the newly delivered furniture, now assembled and arranged. The once exciting prospect of turning her house into a home felt trivial in light of what had just occurred. The boy's face haunted her thoughts, his trembling voice echoing in her ears. As Angela paced, she tried to reason with herself. Perhaps she was overreacting. Children could be dramatic, and the man could have simply been a stressed parent dealing with a disobedient child. But deep down, she knew the fear she had seen was real. Angela finally sat down on her couch, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for her phone. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the keypad. Calling the police felt extreme, especially since she didn't have concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Would they even take her seriously? She was new to the neighborhood and didn't want to make enemies on her first week there. Instead, she decided to call Howard. Her eldest son was her rock, always practical and level-headed. He would know what to do. The phone rang twice before Howard picked up. "Hey, Mom," he greeted, his tone cheerful. "How's the new house? Settling in okay?" Angela exhaled a shaky breath. "Howard, something's happened," she began, recounting the encounter with the boy and the intimidating man. She tried to keep her voice calm, but the concern seeped through. Howard listened patiently before responding. "Mom, it's probably nothing," he said, his tone reassuring. "Maybe the kid was just being dramatic. You know how kids are. And the man, well, he might have just been having a bad day. You're new there, so it's easy to misread things." Angela frowned. "Howard, I know what I saw. That boy was terrified. And the way the man grabbed him, it didn't feel right." "Mom, I'm just a few blocks away," Howard said, his voice firm. "If anything else happens, call me and I'll come over. But for now, just let it be. You don't want to start off on the wrong foot with the neighbors." Angela reluctantly agreed, though her unease remained. After ending the call, she stood by the window, watching the house across the street. The curtains were drawn, and no movement was visible. The quiet seemed oppressive now, a heavy blanket of tension that Angela couldn't shake. Hours passed, and Angela tried to distract herself by unpacking more boxes and organizing her belongings. But as the sun began to set, she found herself drawn back to the window, her eyes fixed on the neighbor's house. Something about it felt off. The boy's fear, the man's hostility, the slammed door, it all pointed to a story that wasn't as innocent as Howard believed. As night fell, Angela decided to install the CCTV cameras delivered earlier that day. She wasn't tech-savvy, but the instructions seemed straightforward enough. If nothing else, she reasoned, the cameras would give her peace of mind. By the time she finished, the streetlights had flickered on, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Angela stepped onto her porch to test the camera angles. As she adjusted the front camera, her eyes were drawn once again to the house across the street. There, in the second-story window, stood the boy. His small figure was silhouetted against the faint glow of a lamp. Angela's breath hitched as he raised a hand and slowly traced letters onto the fogged glass. H-E-L-P. Angela's heart stopped. She froze, staring at the desperate message until the boy was yanked violently away from the window, disappearing into the darkness. The curtain fell back into place, hiding whatever horrors lay behind it. For a moment, Angela was paralyzed with indecision. Then, with trembling hands, she reached for her phone. This time, she dialed 911. The silent cry. Angela Carter's heart pounded as she held her phone, waiting for the 911 operator to pick up. The image of the boy, Jaden, she recalled the man calling him. Standing at the window and tracing the word HELP onto the glass was burned into her mind. His fear, his trembling frame, and the look of desperation in his eyes had left her with no doubt. Something was terribly wrong in that house. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice finally answered, pulling Angela out of her frantic thoughts. Angela swallowed hard, gripping the phone tightly. Hello, yes. I'm not sure how to explain this, but I think a child might be in danger. My neighbor's son, he came to my house earlier, terrified, and then I saw him in the window. He wrote the word help on the glass. The operator's voice remained calm, but the tone shifted, more focused now. Ma'am, can you give me the address and tell me what you've observed? Angela quickly rattled off her address and the one across the street. She described the earlier interaction with Jaden, the shoebox he clutched, and his plea for help. She hesitated before mentioning the man, Corey, whose presence had been so unnerving. He seems dangerous, she added quietly. The boy looked terrified of him. Understood, the operator replied. Officers will be dispatched to your location. Please stay inside your home and do not approach the residence. Angela thanked the operator and hung up, her hands still shaking. She double-checked the locks on her doors and windows before sitting down on the couch. Her eyes kept darting toward the window, watching for any sign of movement from the house across the street. Minutes felt like hours as she waited, her heart racing with a mix of fear and determination. Finally, the distant sound of sirens broke the oppressive silence. Angela exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding as two police cars pulled up in front of Corey's house. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street, casting eerie shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Angela watched intently as two officers stepped out of their vehicles, their movements calm but purposeful. They approached the house and knocked firmly on the door. For a moment, there was no response. Angela's stomach churned with anxiety. What if Corey refused to answer? What if he had already hurt the boy, or worse? Then the door opened, and Corey appeared. Even from her vantage point, Angela could see his stiff posture and the tight, forced smile on his face. He spoke with the officers, his hands gesturing casually as if trying to downplay the situation. Angela couldn't hear their conversation, but the tension in the air was palpable. After a few minutes, one of the officers stepped inside the house, while the other remained on the porch with Corey. Angela leaned closer to the window, her pulse quickening. What would they find inside? Would Jaden be okay? The officer who had entered the house reappeared moments later, speaking quietly to his partner. To Angela's horror, both officers soon turned and walked back to their patrol cars. Corey stood in the doorway, watching them leave with a smug expression. Angela's stomach sank as the police vehicles drove away, the flashing lights fading into the distance. "No," she whispered, her hands clenched into fists. "They can't just leave." Her phone buzzed, startling her. She grabbed it, hoping it was the police calling with an explanation. Instead, it was Howard. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "I saw police cars on your street." Angela quickly explained everything. The boy's plea, the message in the window, and the police visit. "But they just left, Howard," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "How could they leave him there?" Howard sighed. "Mom, the police can't do much without solid evidence. If they didn't see anything suspicious, their hands are tied." "But Jaden asked for help," Angela insisted. "I know what I saw." "Look, I get it," Howard said gently. "But you need to be careful. You're new to the neighborhood. You don't want to make enemies. Maybe it's best to let this go." Angela felt a surge of frustration. "Let it go. Howard, that boy is in trouble. How can I just ignore that?" Howard was silent for a moment before replying. "I'll come by tomorrow, okay? We'll figure this out together. Just stay safe tonight, Mom." Angela reluctantly agreed and ended the call. But as the night deepened, her unease grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed Jaden by not doing more. The next morning, Angela woke early, her sleep restless and filled with unsettling dreams. She made herself a cup of tea and stood by the window, staring at the house across the street. It looked so ordinary in the daylight, its neatly trimmed lawn and flower beds giving no hint of the darkness within. As Angela sipped her tea, a movement caught her eye. Corey was leaving the house, a gym bag slung over his shoulder. He got into his car and drove off, leaving the street quiet once again. Angela's heart raced. If Corey was gone, this might be her chance to help Jaden. But what could she do? She couldn't just barge into their house. She needed a plan. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Angela froze, her tea sloshing slightly in its cup. Setting it down, she approached the door cautiously. When she opened it, her breath caught. Jaden stood on her porch again, his small frame even more fragile in the harsh morning light. His clothes were wrinkled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. In his hands, he clutched the shoebox, just as he had the day before. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, you have to help us." Angela knelt down to his level, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "Jaden, what's in the box?" she asked softly. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before carefully lifting the lid. Angela gasped. Inside was a newborn baby, her tiny body wrapped in a thin, dirty blanket. The baby's breathing was shallow, and her skin was pale. "This is my sister," Jaden said, his voice breaking. "She's sick. Mommy said to keep her safe. But Mommy's not okay." Angela's heart clenched. She didn't need to hear more to know the situation was dire. "Come inside, both of you," she said firmly, ushering Jaden and the baby into her house. As soon as they were inside, Angela locked the door and turned to Jaden. "What's going on in that house? Why didn't the police help yesterday?" Jaden's eyes filled with tears. He told them everything was fine. He always does. They believe him. Angela's chest tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was devastating. "Okay," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "We'll take care of your sister first. Then we'll figure out what to do." She carefully took the shoebox from Jaden and placed it on the couch. The baby stirred, her tiny fists clenching weakly. Angela gently picked her up, cradling her against her chest. "She's cold," she murmured. "We need to warm her up." Jaden nodded, his face pale but determined. "I'll do whatever you say, Mom." Angela guided him to the kitchen, where they quickly prepared a warm bottle of milk. As she fed the baby, she made a silent vow. She didn't know how yet, but she was going to protect these children, no matter what it took. The fractured truth. Angela sat in her living room. The baby nestled securely in her arms, her soft cries subsiding as the warmth of the blanket and milk soothed her. Jaden sat on the couch beside her, his small frame curled tightly as though bracing against an invisible storm. His eyes darted nervously to the windows and door, and every distant sound made him flinch. Angela's heart ached for him, but she knew she couldn't let emotion cloud her judgment now. The situation required careful thought and decisive action. "Jaden," Angela began gently, her voice calm but firm. "I need you to tell me everything. What's happening in that house? Why did you come to me, and what can I do to help?" Jaden hesitated, his small hands gripping his knees as he avoided her gaze. Angela placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're safe here," she said softly. "No one's going to hurt you or your sister." The boy took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as though the weight of the world rested on him. Mommy's not okay," he finally whispered. "She's sick. She can't get out of bed anymore. And he doesn't care. He's mean to her, to us. He hits." Jaden's voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. Angela felt a surge of anger and helplessness. She knelt in front of him, gently pulling his hands away from his face. "Jaden, listen to me," she said, her voice steady. "You don't have to go back there. You and your sister deserve to be safe and cared for. I'm going to make sure that happens." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "But he'll come looking for us," he choked out. "He always finds us. And if he does—" Jaden's words trailed off, but the fear in his voice said everything Angela needed to know. Angela sat back on her heels, her mind racing. She had to protect these children, but she couldn't do it alone. The police had already dismissed her concerns once, but maybe this time, with more evidence, they would listen. Her gaze fell to the baby in her arms, her tiny body a silent testament to the urgency of the situation. Angela quickly grabbed her phone and snapped a photo of the baby. She then gently encouraged Jaden to show her any bruises or marks he might have, but the boy shook his head vehemently, pulling his shirt tightly around him. Angela didn't push. "Okay," she said softly, "but I need you to trust me, Jaden. I'm going to help you, but I need to know as much as you can tell me." Jaden hesitated, then nodded. "He's not my real dad," he said quietly. "Mommy met him a year ago. He was nice at first, but after he moved in, everything changed. He started yelling all the time, hitting stuff, hitting us. Mommy told him to leave, but he wouldn't. He said if she tried to make him he'd hurt us. Angela's jaw tightened. This wasn't just neglect or a domestic dispute. It was a volatile and dangerous situation. She needed to act fast, but first, she had to ensure Jaden and the baby were safe while she sought help. Angela led Jaden to the guest bedroom, urging him to lie down and rest while she cared for the baby. She brought him a glass of water and tucked him in, his small body trembling despite the blanket she draped over him. "I'm right here," she reassured him. "If you need anything, call for me. I'll hear you." Jaden nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Within minutes, he was asleep, his small chest rising and falling rhythmically. Angela lingered by the doorway, her heart breaking for the boy who had clearly endured far more than any child should. Returning to the living room, Angela cradled the baby and stared at her phone. She dialed Howard's number, praying he would pick up this time. The call went straight to voicemail. Frustrated but undeterred, she left a message, explaining the situation in brief detail and begging him to come over as soon as possible. Next, Angela called the police again, this time emphasizing the severity of the situation and the presence of the infant in poor condition. The operator assured her that an officer would be dispatched, but Angela could hear the skepticism in their tone. She hung up, her resolve hardening. If the authorities wouldn't take this seriously, she would escalate it herself. Hours passed, and Angela's anxiety grew with each tick of the clock. The baby had settled into a light sleep, and Jaden remained in the guest room, his soft snores occasionally reaching Angela's ears. The house felt eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made her hyper-aware of every creak and rustle. Suddenly, a loud knock shattered the stillness, causing Angela to jump. Her heart raced as she approached the door, her mind flashing through worst-case scenarios. Peering through the peephole, she saw 2 police officers standing on her porch. Relief flooded through her as she opened the door. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, tipping his hat, "we received your call. Can we come in?" Angela stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "The children are here. The boy's name is Jaden, and his sister is just a newborn. Their mother is in trouble, and the man in that house." She pointed toward Corey's house. "He's dangerous." The officers exchanged a glance before one of them spoke. "We'll need to speak with the boy and assess the situation," he said. "Do you have a place where we can talk privately?" Angela nodded and led them to the guest room. Jaden stirred as they entered, his eyes widening in fear when he saw the uniformed men. "It's okay, Jaden," Angela said gently, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "These officers are here to help." The boy's lip quivered, but he nodded. Over the next several minutes, the officers asked him questions, their voices calm and patient. Jaden hesitated at first, but Angela's reassuring presence seemed to give him courage. He described the abuse, the threats, and the desperate attempt to save his sister. When the officers finally stepped out of the room, their expressions were grim. "We'll need to investigate further," one of them said. "We'll contact Child Protective Services and see about getting these kids somewhere safe." Angela nodded, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "Please, don't let them go back there." "We won't," the officer promised. "But we'll need you to keep an eye on them until CPS can arrive." Angela agreed, her resolve strengthening. She wasn't going to let anything happen to these children, not while they were under her roof. As the officers left to gather more information, Angela prepared a small meal for Jaden, who ate hungrily but silently. The baby remained in her arms, her tiny fingers occasionally clutching at Angela's blouse. That night, Angela sat by the window, keeping watch over the darkened street. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't let Jaden and his sister face this nightmare alone. Shadows in the night. The house was eerily quiet as Angela sat in her living room, cradling the infant in her arms. The rhythmic hum of the heater was the only sound, a fragile cocoon of warmth against the growing tension outside. Jaden was still asleep in the guest room, his frail body finally finding a moment of peace. Angela, however, couldn't rest. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows felt like a prelude to something ominous. Her thoughts raced. The police had left with a promise to involve Child Protective Services, but Angela couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they hadn't grasped the urgency of the situation. She had seen Corey's face, his calculated hostility, and the raw fear in Jaden's eyes. This wasn't just a case of domestic strife. It was a ticking time bomb. Angela stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out. Corey's house across the street was dark, the curtains drawn tight. It looked as still and unassuming as any other home in the neighborhood. But Angela knew better. The boy's trembling hands, the baby's frailty, the bruises barely hidden under Jaden's oversized shirt, all of it painted a grim picture. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. She grabbed it quickly, hoping it was Howard, but her heart sank when she saw the number. Unknown. Reluctantly, she answered. "Hello." A deep, gravelly voice came through the line. "Mind your business." Angela froze, her grip tightening on the phone. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "You don't want trouble, lady," the voice continued, ignoring her question. "Stay out of it. You'll regret it if you don't." The line went dead. Angela stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down on the table. The implications were clear. Corey knew. He knew she had called the police, and he wasn't going to let it go. Angela's mind raced. Should she call the police again? Would they even take her seriously after the first visit? She glanced at the baby, now asleep on the couch, and then toward the guest room where Jaden rested. Her protective instincts surged. Whatever happened, she couldn't let Corey get to them. Angela decided to review the footage from her newly installed CCTV system. She hadn't had time to test it thoroughly, but now it felt like her best chance to gather evidence. Grabbing the instruction manual, she sat down at the dining table and began to follow the steps to access the recordings. After several frustrating minutes, she managed to pull up the live feed from the cameras. The screen showed the quiet street, her driveway, and the front yard of Corey's house. She rewound the footage to earlier in the evening, just after the police had left. Her breath caught as she saw Corey emerge from his house. He stood on his porch for a long moment, looking directly at her house. Even through the grainy footage, his expression was chilling, a mix of anger and cold calculation. He had then paced back and forth, his hand gripping a cigarette, before disappearing back inside. Angela fast-forwarded through the footage, her unease growing. Around midnight, the camera picked up movement again. This time, it was a car pulling into Corey's driveway. Two men got out, their faces obscured by the shadows. Corey appeared to greet them, his posture tense. The three spoke briefly before heading inside, the door closing behind them. Angela stared at the screen, her stomach churning. Who were these men? What were they planning? The sense of danger grew stronger with each passing second. The sound of soft crying pulled Angela away from the footage. She hurried to the couch, where the baby had begun to stir, her tiny face scrunching up in discomfort. Angela gently picked her up, rocking her back and forth until the cries subsided. "Sha, it's okay, little one," Angela whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You're safe here." But even as she said the words, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that safety was slipping further and further away. The next morning arrived too slowly. Angela had spent the night alternating between watching the CCTV footage and checking on Jaden and the baby. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, she finally felt a small sense of relief. Daylight always seemed to push the shadows back, even if only temporarily. Jaden woke up shortly after, his expression wary but less fearful than the day before. Angela prepared breakfast for him, a simple plate of scrambled eggs and toast, but the boy barely ate. He sat at the table, glancing nervously toward the windows. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. "The police said they'd call someone to help, people who make sure kids like you and your sister are safe." Jaden shook his head, his shoulders tensing. "They've come before," he said, "but he always makes them go away. He tells them lies, and they believe him." Angela frowned. "This time will be different," she said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Jaden didn't respond. His gaze dropped to his plate, his small hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. Angela reached out and placed her hand over his. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. "I'm going to help you." Later that afternoon, a knock at the door startled Angela. Her heart raced as she approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. To her relief, it was a social worker, accompanied by 2 police officers. Angela opened the door, ushering them inside. The social worker, a kind-looking woman in her 40s, introduced herself as Ms. Roberts. "We're here to speak with Jaden," she explained, "and to assess the situation." Angela nodded, leading them to the guest room. Jaden sat on the bed, his expression wary but calm. Ms. Roberts crouched down to his level, speaking to him in a soft, reassuring tone. Over the next hour, Jaden shared his story again, his voice trembling but steady. When the social worker and officers emerged from the room, their expressions were grim. "We'll be taking the children into protective custody," Ms. Roberts said. "They'll be placed in a safe environment while we investigate further." Angela felt a mix of relief and sadness. "You'll make sure they're okay?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Ms. Roberts nodded. "We'll do everything we can." As Angela watched the social worker and officers drive away with Jaden and the baby, her heart felt heavy. She had done everything she could to protect them, but the sense of unease lingered. Corey's house across the street remained dark and silent, but Angela knew the quiet wouldn't last. That night, as she reviewed the CCTV footage again, a new chill ran down her spine. On the screen, Corey stood in his driveway, staring at her house. This time, he wasn't alone. The 2 men from the previous night flanked him, their postures menacing. Angela realized then that the fight wasn't over. Corey wasn't going to let this go, and neither was she. The storm arrives. Angela stood in her living room, her hands trembling as she replayed the CCTV footage. Corey stood in his driveway, flanked by the 2 men, their presence a menacing shadow over the neighborhood. They hadn't moved much, but their body language said it all. They were waiting, watching, and undoubtedly planning. Her stomach churned with anxiety, but Angela wasn't one to back down from a fight. Not when children's lives were at stake. Jaden and the baby were safe now, in the hands of Child Protective Services, but she knew Corey wouldn't stop at that. His threats were clear, and his presence across the street was a constant reminder of the storm brewing. Angela grabbed her phone and dialed Howard's number. This time, her son answered almost immediately. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "You've been leaving me messages all day." Angela wasted no time explaining. She recounted everything: the children, Corey, the police visits, and now the footage of Corey and his associates. "Howard, this isn't just about those kids anymore. I think I'm in danger." Howard's tone shifted, becoming sharper. "Mom, why didn't you call me sooner? I'm coming over right now. Lock the doors and don't answer the door for anyone. Do you hear me?" Angela nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I've already locked everything. Just hurry." Howard hung up, and Angela was left alone with the deafening silence of the house. She paced the living room, glancing occasionally at the CCTV monitor. Corey and the 2 men were no longer visible, but that didn't comfort her. If anything, their absence felt more ominous. Minutes felt like hours as Angela waited for Howard to arrive. Every sound outside made her jump: the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a car engine. She kept her phone in her hand, ready to call the police at a moment's notice. Finally, headlights appeared at the end of the street. Angela exhaled in relief as she recognized Howard's car pulling into her driveway. She rushed to the door, unlocking it just as Howard knocked. "Mom," he said, stepping inside and pulling her into a hug. "Are you okay?" Angela nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm fine, but I'm scared, Howard. That man, he's dangerous." Howard glanced around the house, his eyes scanning every corner. "You're right to be scared," he said, "but you're not alone anymore. Let's figure this out." Angela led him to the dining table, where her laptop displayed the CCTV footage. She played the clip of Corey and the two men, her finger pointing to the screen. "Look at them. They're planning something. I know it." Howard's jaw tightened as he watched. "We need to report this to the police again," he said. "They can't ignore this kind of behavior." Angela hesitated. "They didn't take me seriously last time. What if they just brush it off again?" "They won't this time," Howard said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Howard called the police, explaining the situation in detail. This time, his calm yet authoritative tone seemed to get through. The dispatcher assured him that officers would be sent immediately. While they waited, Howard double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows. He even moved a heavy dresser in front of the back door, creating a makeshift barricade. "It's probably overkill," he admitted, "but better safe than sorry." Angela nodded, grateful for his presence. She felt a little safer with Howard there, but the unease in her chest refused to fade. The sound of approaching sirens broke the tension. Angela and Howard watched as two police cars pulled up in front of Corey's house. Officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they approached the front door. Angela held her breath as Corey answered, his posture casual but his eyes sharp. The officers spoke with him for several minutes, their body language calm but firm. Corey gestured toward Angela's house at one point, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned to their cars. One of them approached Angela's house, knocking on the door. Howard opened it, standing protectively in front of his mother. "Good evening," the officer said. "I wanted to update you. We spoke with Mr. Corey. He claims he was simply outside smoking with friends and denies any intent to intimidate you." Howard frowned. "And you believed him?" The officer hesitated. "We didn't find any evidence of a direct threat, but we've warned him to stay away from your property. If he does anything else, call us immediately." Angela felt frustration bubbling up. "That's it? A warning? He's been threatening me and those children." The officer raised a hand to calm her. "I understand your concerns, ma'am. We'll be keeping an eye on the situation. If anything changes, don't hesitate to call." As the officers left, Angela sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "They're not going to do anything," she muttered. "They don't believe me." Howard placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out, Mom. He's not going to get away with this." The night deepened, and Angela and Howard stayed vigilant. Howard sat by the window, his eyes fixed on Corey's house, while Angela tried to distract herself by organizing the kitchen. The minutes dragged on, the silence heavy with anticipation. Around midnight, a soft noise caught Angela's attention. She froze, her hand hovering over a stack of plates. The sound came again, a faint scraping, like metal against glass. "Howard," she whispered, her voice trembling. Howard was already on his feet, his body tense. "Stay here," he said, moving toward the back door. Angela's heart pounded as she followed him, unable to stay put. They reached the kitchen together, where the sound was louder now, coming from the window. Howard grabbed a heavy frying pan from the counter and motioned for Angela to stay behind him. As they approached the window, the scraping stopped. Howard flipped on the outside light, illuminating the backyard. For a moment, everything seemed still, until they saw it. A small object, wrapped in cloth, sat on the windowsill. Howard opened the window cautiously, grabbing the bundle. He unwrapped it, revealing a brick with a note tied to it. The note read, "Last warning. Stay out of my business." Angela felt her knees go weak. Howard clenched the brick, his jaw tightening in anger. "That's it," he said. "We're not waiting for the police anymore. This ends now." Angela watched as Howard pulled out his phone, dialing a number she didn't recognize. "Who are you calling?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A friend," Howard replied. "A private investigator. If the police won't help us, we'll gather the evidence ourselves." The night stretched on as they waited for Howard's contact to arrive. Angela couldn't sleep, her mind racing with fear and anger. Corey had made his threats clear, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, or until someone stopped him. When the investigator finally arrived, Angela felt a glimmer of hope. The man, a tall, no-nonsense figure named Marcus, listened carefully as Howard and Angela explained everything. He nodded thoughtfully, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "I'll handle this," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But you need to be careful. People like Corey don't back down easily." Angela nodded, her resolve hardening. She had come too far to give up now. Whatever it took, she would protect herself and ensure that Corey faced justice and shadows. Angela sat at her dining table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of lukewarm tea. The night's tension had turned her house into a fortress of fear, and the weight of the brick's threat loomed heavy in her mind. Marcus, the private investigator Howard had called, was reviewing the CCTV footage with a meticulous focus. His presence brought a small measure of relief, but Angela knew the danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "This footage is good," he said, nodding toward the laptop screen. "It shows Corey and his associates acting suspiciously, but we'll need more concrete evidence if we want to nail him down. Something that connects him directly to the threats and the abuse." Angela frowned. "Isn't the brick with the note enough?" "It's a start," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "But Corey strikes me as the type who's careful. We need to catch him in the act. Something undeniable." Howard, pacing near the window, turned toward them. "So what do we do? Wait for him to make another move?" "Not exactly," Marcus said. "We take control of the narrative." The plan. Angela, Howard, and Marcus spent the next hour devising a plan. Marcus suggested setting up additional surveillance, not just outside but inside the house. "If Corey's bold enough to send threats, he might escalate," Marcus explained. "We need to be ready." Angela's stomach churned at the thought of Corey breaking into her home, but she nodded. Whatever it takes to protect those kids and stop him. Marcus also suggested gathering testimonies. If the kids in CPS care can corroborate the abuse, it'll strengthen the case. "I'll reach out to the caseworker." Howard added another layer to the plan. "Mom, you'll stay at my place until this is resolved. It's safer." Angela hesitated. "But what if Corey comes back here? If I'm gone?" "We'll make it look like you're still here," Marcus interjected. "Leave the lights on, have a car in the driveway. It might draw him out, but we'll be watching." Angela reluctantly agreed. The idea of leaving her home unsettled her, but she trusted Marcus and Howard to handle things. The waiting game. The following day, Angela moved into Howard's guest room. It felt strange to leave her house, but as she watched Howard and Marcus set up hidden cameras inside and outside the property, she realized it was the best choice. From Howard's living room, Angela monitored the live CCTV feed, her heart pounding every time a shadow moved across the screen. Marcus stayed near the house, parked discreetly down the street in an unmarked car. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to Angela's growing anxiety. Howard, meanwhile, checked in with CPS, ensuring Jaden and the baby were safe and gathering any additional details about Corey's behavior. Hours turned into days, and nothing happened. Angela began to doubt the plan, wondering if Corey had sensed their trap. But just as she started to relax, the storm finally broke. The confrontation, It was late on the third night when the motion detectors outside Angela's house triggered an alert. Angela, sitting in Howard's living room, jolted upright as the feed displayed Corey approaching her front door. He was alone this time, but his movements were deliberate. He carried a crowbar in one hand, his posture radiating anger. Angela's breath caught in her throat. "He's there," she whispered, her voice trembling. Howard was already on the phone with Marcus. "I see him," Marcus confirmed over the line. "Stay put. I'm calling the police." Angela watched in frozen silence as Corey pried open her front door. The cameras inside captured his entry, his calculated movements as he scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the setup meant to make the house appear occupied. "He's looking for something, or someone," Angela said, her voice barely audible. On the screen, Corey's face twisted in frustration. He muttered something under his breath and began rifling through drawers and cabinets, his search growing more erratic. When he reached the dining table and saw the brick from his earlier threat, now sitting in plain view, his expression darkened. Marcus's voice came through the phone again. "The police are on their way. They'll catch him in the act." But Corey wasn't waiting. He grabbed the brick and hurled it across the room, smashing a vase on a nearby shelf. His rage was palpable, and Angela's fear for what he might do next spiked. The arrest. Red and blue lights flashed across the CCTV feed as police cars pulled up outside the house. Corey froze, his eyes darting toward the window. He moved quickly, heading for the back door, but Marcus had anticipated this. The investigator stepped into view, blocking Corey's exit. "End of the line, Corey," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. Corey's eyes darted between Marcus and the approaching officers, his grip tightening on the crowbar. For a moment, Angela thought he might fight, but the presence of multiple officers left him no choice. He dropped the crowbar with a loud clang and raised his hands in surrender. Angela exhaled in relief as the officers cuffed Corey and led him to one of the patrol cars. Watching the scene unfold, she felt a mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and a lingering fear of what could have happened. The aftermath. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. With Corey in custody, the police and CPS worked together to gather evidence and testimonies. Jaden and the baby, safe in their temporary foster care, were crucial in corroborating the abuse. Marcus's footage, combined with Angela's testimony, painted a damning picture of Corey's actions. Angela returned to her home, but things were different now. She installed additional security measures and kept in close contact with Howard and Marcus. The neighborhood felt quieter, safer, but Angela knew it would take time to feel truly at ease again. One afternoon, Angela received a call from Ms. Roberts, the social worker handling Jaden and the baby's case. "I thought you'd like to know," Ms. Roberts said, her tone warm. "Jaden and his sister have been placed with a loving foster family. They're doing well, and Jaden wanted me to thank you for everything." Tears welled in Angela's eyes. "Tell him he's brave," she said. "Tell him he's stronger than he knows. A new beginning." Months later, Angela stood on her porch, gazing at the quiet street. The scars of what had happened remained, but so did the strength she'd found within herself. She had fought for those children, for their safety, and in doing so, she had rediscovered a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. As the sun set, Angela smiled softly. The shadows would always be there, but now she knew how to face them.